Welcome to episode 70 of Tales from the Bridge. We are super happy to have Fonda Lee on the show today. Fonda is a wonderfully talented author, so we're very grateful to have the chance to talk to Fonda. Friend of the Bridge, Miranda, is joining us on this one, so she joins Kevin and Sam and Fonda, and this is just a great conversation. I really enjoyed this one. We hope you do too. Check the show notes for links to Fonda's work. All right, everyone's waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
Here today with Fonda Lee. Fonda Lee is an award-winning science fiction and fantasy author. Jade City, the first in the Green Bone Saga, won the World Fantasy Award in 2018 and was named as one of the best 100 fantasy books of all time by Time magazine. Fonda is a fellow Canadian, an expert world builder, former corporate strategist, and holds a black belt in both Kung Fu and karate. Her next release is Untethered Sky. It comes out in April. It's a quietly beautiful story that explores grief, love, sadness, and hope, and the monsters that kill other monsters. We're so happy to have you on the show, Fonda.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So we're just going to jump right into some questions. The first question I have is, you just on your Twitter announced the next project that you're working on. I know we're jumping a little bit ahead, but cyberpunk swordswomen. Can you share any more about that? It's so exciting.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. So I was writing the Green Bone Saga for many, many years, and I had this idea that just kept being pushed to the back burner because I had this big epic fantasy trilogy to finish. But I am a big fan of Chambara, samurai movies, and I have envisioned this story that I've been kind of calling what you would get if Akira Kurosawa wrote Dune, but it's kind of blended with cyberpunk, and it's sort of like a last job story about this aging swordswoman and espionage and isolated harsh colony planet. And and I'm excited to finally be able to get around to writing it. So it is, and also to get back to writing science fiction, because I love both sides of that speculative coin, both fantasy and science fiction. So having spent so much time writing this fantasy trilogy, I was like, I'm eager to dive back into the sci-fi side. So that is my next big project. I'm toiling away on it now, and just excited to share the news. Oftentimes in publishing, it's you things are happening, but you can't talk about them for a long time. So now I get to finally publicly talk about it.
Have you just started working on it, or are you just crafting the world?
I'm drafting it. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm in the drafting process.
So a few years down the road.
It is. Okay. Yeah. 2025.
Okay, perfect. At least we have a date. That's exciting.
I do have a date. That is true. A deadline. So that'll keep me motivated.
Yes. When you are world building, both the Green Bone Saga and Untethered Sky, you just end up in the world, and you don't do a lot of exposition when you're world building, but they're so fully realized worlds. Can you talk a little bit about your world building process?
Oh gosh, world building is such a iterative process for me. It's not kind of a phase. It's more just something that is constantly going on. So it starts with the very premise of the story, and of the building of both the plot and the characters, because I think of narrative as this three-legged stool where you've got the world, you've got the plot, and you have the characters, and they're constantly in conversation with each other. So when I'm researching something and I discover some cool factoid, and I put that into the world, that might have then an influence on how those characters act because of the cultural context that they were raised in, or something about the geography might dictate how people have developed their society. So all of those things have an impact on the characters, and their decisions impact the plot, and then sometimes the plot necessitates you having to go down a side street of doing more research into your world and fleshing out a part of the world that you hadn't fleshed out before. And this could happen while you're drafting or while you're revising. So it's this constant, endless loop of continuing to work all those three pieces in tandem. And my approach to world building has always been that I want the fantasy and the science fiction worlds that I create to feel as real as I can possibly make them feel. We all sometimes love the totally wild, crazy magic worlds. But that's not really what I lean into. Like I love having that speculative element, but then kind of making it feel very almost downplayed. And I think readers will say this about the Green Bone Saga, some of them with appreciation and some of them with disappointment, that it doesn't always feel like this is it's not like a high fantasy novel in the sense that like the magic takes the front stage, right? Like it really is just sort of infused into the world in a sort of a low, I guess there's this sort of, it's a constant presence, but it's not like the big thing that you're reading the book for. And the same, and I just want the city and the people to feel as real as they can be, even though there's this like speculative element, or if it's a secondary world that is like that's different from our own and the countries are different. I still want it to feel like, oh, you could go to Janloon, you could, walk down the street, you could go into the Twice Lucky and have crispy squid balls. And with Untethered Sky, I wanted that sort of same experience of like, okay, this is a world with giant monsters, but it should feel like it's natural. Like those people aren't like, oh my goodness, giant monsters all the time. Like they have this life where they just sort of accept, that these creatures are there and they've sort of, they're a natural part of the ecology. And so they've of course adapted, their culture has developed an entire, profession around dealing, with these giant monsters. So that's how I approach world building. I just wanted to feel really authentic, like you could go and visit these places.
When you do that, do you write parts of the world? Do you have like kind of a set of appendices that you write about the world that may not be part of the book, but you do it for yourself to get yourself into that world?
I do a lot of just free writing as part of the development process, and I'll have little files. I use Scrivener for my actual drafting, so I'll have little files within my large manuscript document that'll just be like, I don't know, ecology or religion, and I'll throw a bunch of world building into those, and so I do sort of have a bunch of random things. I mean, the Green Bone Saga has like I think I have files on there like flowers and their significance, because it's a small thing that isn't really important to the plot, but like there's different times throughout all those novels where people have sent flowers symbolizing marital happiness or health or whatever. And so like, I have to keep track of all that, of like, all these flowers that I put into the story and what they all mean. So yeah, I do kind of keep track of all that, but also like, I know not all of that has to go into the book. That's sort of the danger, right, of being a fantasy author, is that you get carried away by the world building and you get tempted to just put all this stuff in. It really does have to be the story that's driving the world. I think some authors may do it differently. I certainly know some authors who started off maybe with a world that they had created through role-playing games or what have you, and then they're like, oh, what's a story I can set in here? But I usually go about it. I usually always am like, okay, what are the demands of the story that I write, and like, what do I need to show of the world in order to tell that story?
That makes a lot of sense, because I mean, if magic is sort of native to the world that your characters live in, they're not going to focus on it all the time any differently than I would maybe focus on my phone, as compared to someone who's never, say a century ago would look at my iPhone and go, "That's magic," and that's all I got to talk about. When you do this and you kind of make this a sort of more natural feeling world, is there a difference between what the characteristics and things that go into a fantasy world versus a sci-fi world building experience, or is it much the same exercise?
I think one of the reasons why I like writing on both sides of the genre is that I do approach them very similarly. I think of both the high-tech elements or the magic elements in very much the same way. And they're tools. They're tools that you can use as a writer, but they're also tools insofar as they're not inherently good or evil. Right? I think fantasy sometimes leans into the like light magic versus dark magic, or like inherently evil versus good. And I kind of think of magic the same way that I think of technology, which is that technology is not inherently good or evil. right? It's how we use it. It's the people who use that tech that make it good or evil. And that's how I approach fantasy world building as well.
All of your character, none of them really fit into either good or evil. There's a lot of like morally gray or questionable decisions, but they're still characters that feel fully realized people and like you really connect to. So when you're writing, do you just follow them along in the story, or do you decide what kind of people they are first and then put them into the world?
Both, mostly the latter, insofar as I know who this character is and what their purpose is in the story and why I want to tell a story about them. Mm-hmm. That said, I learn a lot about them as part of the writing process. So one of the most, enlightening parts of revision is when you write the story and then you go back to the beginning and you start to revise and you come across lines of dialogue and you're like, that's not how that character would say that. Because you've gotten to know them during the course of this whole book. And now you go back and you're like, oh, I like, you can kind of continue to polish them. And so like, I might have a character that I know has a certain personality and fills a certain role. And I'll use Aquilo from the Green Bone Saga, for example, right? Like I knew from the beginning, okay, he's kind of like the hot-headed middle child, right? And like that's sort of the role that he plays at the start of this series. But as I like, and so he like starts off when I'm writing him as kind of like a sort of a broad strokes character when I'm first drafting. And it's through all of his interactions with the other characters and the conversations that I have him have with his family members and with like his subordinates and with his enemies that I polish him into being like a fully realized character that has like a certain way of talking and walking and thinking that like by the end, and once I get to like a certain point, I'm like, oh yeah, I know exactly what he says when he walks into a room. And that is very much the process for all the characters. It's like, I know what role they're going to play. It's almost like acting, I suppose. Like you could be told, hey, you're acting the villain in this story in this play, but then the actor brings their own like nuances. What are the mannerisms? How do they dress, et cetera, et cetera. And like, as the writer, you're sort of figuring that out. Like in a way, you're also playing the actor of all these characters that you've created.
Do you have a favorite character that you've written that you've sort of written out now and you wish you could go back to?
I miss all the characters from the Green Bone Saga now that the trilogy is done. I still will like randomly like think of something that they would do, so it's sort of strange because the trilogy is complete, but those characters, I've lived with them for so many years. So I'd say like just the whole Call family is really just like lives in my head still. And even Barrow was like a fun character to write. The listeners who have read the books will know why.
Yeah. Was it like a big transition to go from the multi-generational world of the Green Bone Saga, and then you did Green Bone novella, but then and then Untethered Sky, and Untethered Sky it's not a short timeline, really.
Right.
It is much shorter than the Green Bone Saga, though. Was it a hard transition, or was it like a nice break for your mind in between?
It was a little of both, but I would say, it was a sort of a brain reset, if you will. So after the Green Bone Saga, I was like, wow, I've written some really, really long books. You know what would be really awesome? Something short. Something short would be just awesome. So I ended up writing the Jade Setter of Janloon, the Green Bone Saga novella. I wrote a few short stories, one in an anthology, and then Uncanny, and I wrote Untethered Sky. So I've just been doing short stuff. And now, I've got other novels, but I really did feel like I need to stretch different storytelling muscles. And I think it's valuable as an author to do that and to just kind of push yourself in different directions and keep it interesting for yourself. So Untethered Sky is so very much kind of the opposite of the Green Bone Saga in some ways, in that, it's a shorter piece, yes, but the Green Bone Saga is modern, it's urban, it's gritty, it's sprawling, it has this big cast of characters. And Untethered Sky is small and intimate, and it's a coming of age story. It's a pre-modern time. It's very rural. It takes place in the countryside and is sort of about these delicate relationships. And so it was nice. It was really nice to write something that was different.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. Like, you've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
It is so different, but having read both the Green Bone Saga and Untethered Sky, it still feels very much like you're writing. Like all of your strengths are still there, even though it's such a different story. Did you read something in Middle Eastern mythology and then decide to create like the manticores and the rocks, a culture around them where they're part of the ecosystem? Or
so it was giant birds of prey. That was the seed of the story. So I did not set out to write like Middle Eastern mythology necessarily, or a fantasy or anything. I just was actually, I'd gotten kind of fascinated in falconry a few years ago, and I would be extremely poorly suited to be a falconer. Like, there's no way. I'm like not really that much of an outdoorsy person. It takes an enormous amount of patience, but I was just fascinated with it because of a few things. I watched this documentary called The Eagle Huntress, and it was about a young woman in Mongolia who was pursuing the art of falconry, her culture, which is training golden eagles to hunt wolves, which is just so badass. And it was like, it was a really fascinating documentary. And I also read a memoir called H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald. And it was about kind of her experience with training a goshawk, while she's also going through kind of a lot of things in her life and the loss of her father. And then I went on, I've always been just sort of found birds of prey really cool. I was in Dublin for Worldcon, and I went on a family vacation kind of after the con, and one of the things that I really wanted to do was go on a hawk walk. So we did that. My whole family and I, we went on this hawk walk with an expert falconer and had like Harris hawks come and land on her arm and go fly off and go after prey and stuff. And that was really really cool. So I was like, of course the fantasy author in me was like, what if like those giant birds of prey? So there were these huge birds of prey in prehistoric times. I can't even remember what they're called, but they were like these eagles that were just basically gigantic, huge things. And it made me think about like the mythical creatures, the rocks, right? Like rocks are from Persian mythology. And I thought, oh wow, what if like we had huge birds of prey, and we, instead of like golden eagles hunting wolves, it was rocks hunting some other huge creature, like, and manticores obviously came to mind for me. And then I started doing some research into the origins of that particular mythology, and they originate from Persia. And so I thought, okay, that it just sort of all like start to come together, and I wanted to sort of, it just made sense to kind of honor the origins of those mythological creatures and place this in a time and a place that would be sort of their natural environment, if you would. So that led me to go do some research into pre-Islamic ancient Persia, specifically the Achaemenid Empire.
It's nice to have some non-Eurocentric fantasy, right? Like, it seems like everything takes place in like some, it seems to be some form of medieval Europe happening in most fantasy. Has there been a change, do you think, in where fantasies are taking place? Are people getting more inventive now?
Definitely. Yeah, for sure. I mean, even when Green Bone Saga first, so Jade City came out in 2017. And at the time, it felt like it was sort of one on the leading edge of a wave of books that were non medieval Europe inspired. And since then, that like wave has only grown. Like right around the time that Green Bone Saga came out, there was Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, City of Brass by Shannon Chakraborty, Poppy War by Rebecca Kwong. So like there sort of became this like movement. I had time at the time that Jade City came out. I'd said on a panel that the book wouldn't have been published even like 5 or 10 years ago. Right? Like there just wasn't that. We hadn't gotten there yet, and now it's like it's a very different landscape, which is fantastic. It's just I think we're at a time in fantasy literature that is just richer and more interesting, more exciting than it ever has been.
To go somewhere else and experience a different culture with like the magic, everything, it was so exciting. It made it so much more interesting because it was like a completely different world.
No, we talk about that like in sci-fi as well. It feels like in the last 10, 15, 20 years, books are being written and published now that have been published as well in that time period that I don't think would have gotten published, where it feels like we've gotten away from the white dude in the basement writing about like sex robots and gotten somewhere more interesting, As a writer, do you feel that publishers are more open to diversity in legacy genres as a whole? Is that a more widespread thing? Does that seem to be going beyond just the fantasy sci-fi realm, or do you think there's still hurdles and challenges that and broader thinking that still needs to happen?
Well, I can only really speak to fantasy and science fiction because that's what I work in. I don't know how the state of things is sort of in other genres, whether mystery and thrillers and romance, like whether they're kind of going through the same things. But I suspect that they are, just sort of from I guess the few things that I do sort of hear in publishing overall, that like there's just been greater awareness and interest and sort of support of like realizing that like we've been sort of centering a lot of stories and have been ignoring a lot of other different types of stories. So I think that there is definitely so speaking science fiction and fantasy specifically, I feel like those of us that are in the industry, that live and breathe it day in and day out, we know that things have changed a lot and that fantasy and sci-fi is a lot richer, more diverse, more exciting than it used to be. But I'm not sure that has trickled out to the general public. So like the casual person who doesn't really read fantasy and sci-fi, or maybe just thinks of it as like still, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, I'm not sure that they are aware of all the cool things that are being written in our genre. And I mean, that explains why we're on Lord of the Rings adaptation number 15 or whatever it is we're on, right? Because like I think most people who are sort of casual consumers still, if I were to say I write fantasy, they're going to be like, oh, like D&D, like that's kind of, I think, still the very surface level understanding that the lay person would have. So I think where the work needs to happen is maybe it is just a time thing, but I think there's still kind of like this barrier between all the cool stuff that's being written and the public consciousness and like what is sort of being picked to for greater awareness and I guess promotion and celebration. And there's still like a disconnect there, right? Like, so it's oftentimes you'll see like the conversation goes like, oh gosh, they've announced, like let's say for example, yet another Lord of the Rings adaptation, and you'll see so many fantasy writers, editors, readers being like, but what about the other, like 300 awesome things that are out there, like, so I think that's where still the struggle is just sort of this disconnect between what we know is happening and like what is still kind of mass market fantasy.
Right. Is there hope that we could see Jade City in TV? Is that still possible? Do you think? I know there was there was in 2020 there was I guess there was a TV deal and it fell through. Is there? Can you? I don't know if you could talk about this at all, but is there any hope of seeing Jade City on the screen where it gets a broader audience and informs an audience of where the genre has gone?
Your guess is as good as mine at this point, Sam. But I mean, I will say, it was with Peacock, and it ended up leaving Peacock, but it has been re-optioned. I'm excited about the team that's working on it now. We are still in early stages and obviously kind of starting from scratch. But Hollywood is one of those strange places where like you never know what's going to happen and nothing ever dies. It just kind of goes into a state of zombification for a little while. And so I'm still hopeful, and there's always a chance. We'll see what happens. I'll keep my fingers crossed along with all the rest of you.
Yeah. The Green Bone Saga is perfect for TV. Like it or it would make the perfect series the way that you've written it. And I think that it would be one of the things that would draw all of the casual watchers into what all of the great things that fantasy is doing right now.
From your lips to the ears of Hollywood, Miranda.
Well, that's a really long telephone game. But are you working with the people that have optioned it? Do you want to be part of that, or would you just sort of like hand it off?
I have so my role in that whole deal is basically as a consulting producer. So that means that like I would have a say in sort of the big picture of, who would potentially be brought on to be a creative lead. I would probably get to take a look at like the scripts and give notes, but I'm not going to be, actively in the writer's room writing the scripts. So I and also sort of it depends on, how much involvement they want. I mean, one of the things about having your books optioned is you really do kind of seed them into, the fate of whoever of the creative team that takes them over and adapts them for screen. And in many ways, I think that is that can be hard, but it's also good because, my job as a novelist is to write novels, and I don't personally have a desire to adapt my own books for screen. I can just hope that people who are in charge of that are faithful to kind of the spirit of the books and what they, what was important that made them, what they are. But as for like specific script decisions, casting decisions, all that, like that's out of my hands.
And it's interesting because we've heard a very similar story from other authors around their book rights being, optioned, and it just going silent. Right? Mm-hmm. It's not that anybody said no. It's just it kind of just disappears or becomes quiet for a little while. And,
yep.
But yeah, and I think the approach of staying positive perhaps is the way. Could you talk a little bit about your trajectory of getting to becoming a full-time author? Because it's interesting. You have a master's of business administration. You come from a different field. You do a lot of martial arts. Can you tell us a bit about this trajectory to becoming a full-time writer?
Yeah, it was definitely sort of not a straight trajectory, that's for sure. I loved writing when I was a kid. Big bookworm, spent a lot of time in the library, wrote a lot of bad fan fiction, but never really imagined that it would be my profession because I didn't know any writers. Certainly didn't know any writers who looked like me and was like, oh gosh, I guess that's like kind of a sort of magic job, right? It's kind of like, I don't know, astronaut or something like that. Like it's just sort of not something that you think of as like a job that you could do. And I went and got, a business degree. I worked in management consulting and then as in-house strategy in-house strategy at Fortune 500 companies. And so I did kind of the whole business career thing. And then I sort of had like a I get a existential crisis over it all because I reached this point where I wasn't writing anymore. I'd always written just sort of for fun for myself. And I'd always had this pipe dream, like, oh, wouldn't it be so cool to like one day publish a book like that, in the way that you're like, you know what I'd like to do, like climb Kilimanjaro, or like I would like to run a marathon one day, right? So I had this pipe dream of like, oh, I really would like to write a novel one day. And I wasn't writing for fun anymore because I was just so busy. I had this demanding day job. My husband had a demanding day job. We had kids. We were like, we had no time for anything. And I was at this point in my career where I had to make this decision about like which path I wanted to take, right? I'd like spent a few years in my role, and my manager was like, so like, what do you want to do next? Because you could try to get, promoted into this job, or you could switch into this division. Like, what do you want to do? And so it was, a pretty big decision because I was kind of, fairly decently along in my career at that point. And the more I thought about it, I was like, I don't want to do any of these jobs. I just want to write stories. And so I kind of had a like jump out of the airplane with no parachute moment where I said, I'm actually just gonna, instead of like seeking this promotion or this transfer or like go overseas and work, or like instead of all that, I was like, you know what? I'm going to cut back my hours and work part-time. And my manager was like, okay, well, you do what you need to do. Because she thought that like I needed more time for my family and to like have better work-life balance, which was all true. But instead of having better work-life balance, I just started writing a novel in like the time that I had freed up. So instead I was like kind of working two jobs. And that turned into a manuscript, which I queried without success. And then I wrote another manuscript and took that to a writing conference and got an agent. And within like 2 months, I had my debut book deal. And so then one thing led to another. And then I was like, this is fun. I'm going to write more books. So that night I just sort of fired myself like over time. I like transitioned out of my job. Well, first I like after going part-time, I like basically quit, but then like contracted back so I could take projects for short period of time, sock up some money, because writing when you're early in your career doesn't really pay you anything, and then like write for any other time that I wasn't working on client work. And so I just sort of like ramped down my other career and ramped up my writing career. And I'm very fortunate that I was in a position to be able to do that. But it was sort of a detour, because I had all these business school classmates and other colleagues from work that were like, so what do you do now?
It's very different from what a lot of MBAs do, for sure.
It certainly
but,
is.
But you'd been writing for sounds like you've been writing for fun for most of your life before
right.
Yeah, okay. Got it. And you said you're doing some fan fiction. What type of fan fiction?
Oh, very just kind of like bad stuff that will never see the light of day.
Okay.
That goes into a trunk.
And your first published novel, that was Zeroboxer?
Yes.
And both fighting and Zero G?
Yeah.
Was that informed by your own martial artist, your own knowledge, your own black belts?
Yes, although I've never fought in Zero G, so I had to make up, a lot of that stuff.
Okay. Not from firsthand experience.
Right. Not from firsthand experience. But I actually wrote that book because I was working. I was working at Nike, and so I had a lot of insight into sports marketing, and obviously having a martial arts background, and then my love of science fiction. And then I was like, what if I write a story about like an athlete who gets propelled to like this enormous amount of sports celebrity status, but he's not just representing a school or a city or even a nation at the Olympics. He's representing all of Earth in like a future when Earth is no longer the top dog in the planetary ecosystem. So that turned into Zeroboxer. Everything I've written is kind of like and I think this is the case for many authors, is a mashup of like different things that partly your life, partly other stuff that you really like from media and books, and you know, partly your own personal experiences and things that you're just fascinated to like research.
And did you research the physics of fighting in Zero G?
I did, actually. I did a lot of watching video from the ISS and like watching astronauts move around and bounce around. And then I had to like think about how that would translate into like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu moves. And I did a little bit of research too into how lifeguards like control people who are drowning or hang out, like grapple with people, because often that's sort of a semi-weightless environment. So yeah, the odd directions that writing sci-fi and fantasy can take you.
Cool.
Is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to share with our audience? We always want to make sure that people come on, feel comfortable, and that they've been had the opportunity to talk about like all the stuff they've got going on or future projects or what have you.
I mean, you guys have asked some great questions. I do have projects that are in the works or coming out. So Miranda's already mentioned Untethered Sky that comes out on April 11th. And I'm excited to get that out. And then this summer, I have a short story collection coming out, my very first short story collection. I wrote a bunch of short fiction in the Green Bone Saga world, purely because I wanted to spend more time in the world with those characters. And I ended up putting them out initially on Patreon, and then Subterranean Press was like, do you want to publish that as a short story collection and add a really cool cover? I was like, sure. So that is coming out. It's called Jade Shards. That comes out this summer. And then I've got the science fiction duology that I talked about earlier. The first book is called The Last Contract of Isako, and you will have to wait a while for it. But I am looking forward to sharing that. And then I have another project. It's a young adult fantasy duology. It's called Guardian of the Scroll, and it is a collaboration between me and Shannon Lee, the daughter of Bruce Lee. But unbeknownst to me, is actually a big fan of fantasy. And she reached out to me and said, I would really like to write a young adult novel that is inspired by, her father's life, teachings, films, philosophy. So I'm doing that, and so yeah, a lot of stuff, a lot of things in the pipeline. And of course, in the meantime, you can check out my backlist. So Green Bone Saga, if you want to start with that, trilogy. Jade City is the first book.
Nice.
Wow, you have a lot of exciting things coming out. Yeah. What was it like talking to Bruce Lee's daughter? Was it like meeting a hero?
It was pretty amazing. Yeah. I'm not gonna lie. Well, when that call came through, I was like, yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah, was it like a surreal moment to have Bruce Lee's daughter call you and ask you to do a
pretty
project?
Pretty much, yeah. No, it was pretty wild.
And when are that duology coming out?
That one, the first book comes out next summer.
Okay.
Yes, if my year's right. To remember what years my books are coming out.
Well, with the deadline, with the publishing industry, everything's so far apart. It must be hard to schedule. Where can people find you online? You have a Twitter and a Patreon?
I do. So I'm still on the Cursed Bird app at Fonda J. Lee. I'm on Instagram at fonda.lee. My website is fondalee.com. And I also have a Patreon, so you can find me on Patreon as well.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on. I'm so happy to have met you.
Yeah, it's been excellent.
Well, thank you for having me on. This has been great.
Thank you for joining us once again. Hope you enjoyed that one. Next episode, I think it'll be about the book of the month. We'll see what happens. Stay tuned. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.